Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about William Shakespeare's The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, more often just called Othello. So this is a play from 1604. It's one of Shakespeare's greatest tragedies. It's one of the plays that's consistently identified in that sort of top group of these are the best tragedies, along with things like Hamlet, Macbeth, and King Lear. There's a massive amount of stuff to talk about with Othello, and I'm not going to talk about most of it. There's a ton of stuff out there about race in the play, and I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the things I find kind of interesting. But there's much more about race. There's a lot, by modern standards, for modern sensibilities, there's a lot of problematic racial elements here, because Othello, who is a Moor, is not Venetian. So the play starts in Venice, and Othello is a general in the Venetian military. He is a Moor, which means that he is from North Africa. Now, Moor is a kind of broad term that it doesn't necessarily designate a specific group of people in the way that, like, the Tuaregs or the Berbers are specific ethnic groups. Especially probably in England, which was much further away from North Africa than, say, Venice was. The Moors were sort of broad. The term Moor was a sort of broad term that covered North Africans in general, typically Muslims, but could also be applied to sub-Saharan Africans. And so Othello has in many cases been played as or by, because there's a long history of playing Othello in blackface, which is incredibly problematic today. But Othello has long been conceptualized as a sub-Saharan African. There are instances in which he's played as, say, Libyan or Algerian, even Egyptian, something like this. But it's not really clear from the play where Othello is supposed to be from, except that he's a Moor, which, again, we have a very sort of broad term there. So he marries in secret the daughter of Brabantio, who's one of the sort of major counselors of Venice. Her name is Desdemona, and this becomes the sort of major problematic point of the play, because Othello's ensign, his subordinate, the guy who sort of works directly for him, named Iago, uses this marriage to attempt to destroy Othello. And I'm going to talk a lot about Iago because I actually think... So the thing is, the play is called The Tragedy of Othello, but it's really Iago's play. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. So Othello and Desdemona get married in Venice, and then Othello is sent to Cyprus because there's supposed to be a Turkish invasion. That invasion gets thwarted basically by a massive storm at sea that destroys the Turkish fleet. But Othello and Desdemona are now in Cyprus, so they're further away from the Venetian establishment. And what ends up happening is that Iago starts the wheels turning in Othello's mind that Desdemona is cheating on him with Michael Cassio, who's Othello's lieutenant. So Cassio is the second in charge. So Iago starts dropping these hints that maybe something's going on between Desdemona and Cassio that's not exactly on the level. Othello initially is skeptical, but as Iago brings him more and more proof, Othello is won over. At the same time, Iago's running a sort of side con on this guy named Rodrigo, who had been a suitor for Desdemona, and Iago convinces him to sell all his stuff in Venice, come to Cyprus with all his money, and then basically Iago bilks him out of all of his diamonds and jewels and cash, and then eventually gets Rodrigo to attack Michael Cassio in the dark in an attempt to kill off, from Iago's point, preferably both of them. As that's been happening, so one of the other big components that you need to sort of know for understanding and appreciating Othello is that there's a handkerchief. That's one of the key symbols of the play, because Othello had given Desdemona this handkerchief that he had gotten from his mother, which is supposed to be enchanted by a seer. And the premise of the enchantment is a man gives it to the woman that he marries, and they will remain in love for as long as she has that handkerchief. But if she loses it or gives it away, then tragedy will occur. The problem is that Desdemona actually is attempting to comfort Othello. Like, he has a headache at some point, and she's trying to, like, wipe the sweat from his brow, and he knocks the handkerchief out of her hand, and she, out of concern for his health, follows him rather than picking up the handkerchief. So her handmaid Emilia picks it up and gives it to Iago, her husband, because he's been asking her to steal it, which apparently for Emilia does not throw up red flags. Like, that seems like something that you should be concerned about. Like, if your husband is repeatedly being like, hey, steal that handkerchief for me. Nah. Something's going wrong there. That's not a normal thing to ask her to do. But anyway, so that becomes the sort of damning piece of evidence, because Iago takes the handkerchief and he puts it in Cassio's apartment. And so Cassio finds it, and basically he starts carrying it around, and so that becomes the thing that convinces Othello that Desdemona has been cheating on him with Cassio. So, after Rodrigo's attack on Cassio, in which actually Iago stabs Cassio in the leg to try and, take him out too, and then stabs Rodrigo to finish off the job after Cassio wounds Rodrigo. Othello is fully convinced by this point that Desdemona has been cheating on him, and he resolves that he has to kill her. So, he tells her to go to bed and to send her maid away, send Emilia away. Othello goes in, kisses her, smothers her with a pillow. She dies. Emilia comes in and is like, holy fuck, you just killed Desdemona. That's not good. She never cheated on you. So she calls some other Venetian nobles who were there basically to take Othello back to Venice because the Turkish threat is now gone. They come in and they're like, holy fuck, you killed Desdemona. That's not cool. Now we're going to arrest you. And Othello is like, Iago is really to blame here. He told me this was going on. They capture Iago after he stabs Emilia. And then they're going to take him away and torture him. And they're like, Othello, you also have to come with us. We're going to take you back to Venice, basically to stand trial. And he's like, nah, son, I'm going to stab myself. So he does. He kills himself at the end of the play. So a couple of really interesting things for me as I was rereading this play. One is how little Othello is actually in the play prior to Act 5. I mean, his name is on the marquee. It is Othello in big letters at the beginning of the play, but he drives almost none of the action. I mean, he marries Desdemona in secret, but then, like, he sails to Cyprus because he's told to. He gets manipulated by Iago. Iago is running the show, and he seems to be the one. I haven't counted the lines or looked up a comparative line count or anything like this, but Iago seems to be the one who is on stage the majority of the time. So it's really Iago's play. He's the puppet master pulling the strings and getting everybody to do what he wants them to do. But one of the really... So Iago is a criminal genius as far as manipulating all of these people into doing what he wants them to do. But one of the things that I find most fascinating about him is it's really hard to pin down his motive. In part because Iago lies continually, but also in part because he gives us a couple of different motives. He gives a couple of different reasons why he wants to destroy Othello. The first one we actually get in Act 1, Scene 1, almost right from the beginning. I don't know if you can hear my cat screaming outside the door. Roderigo says, "Thou toldst me thou didst hold him in thy hate." And Iago says, "Despise me if I do not. 3 great ones of the city in personal suit to make me his lieutenant oft capped to him. And by the faith of man I know my price. I am no worse a place. But he, as loving his own pride and purposes, evades them with a bombast circumstance, horribly stuffed with epithets of war, non suits my mediators. For, certes, says he, I have already chose my officer. And what was he? Forsooth a great arithmetician, one Michael Cassio, a Florentine, a fellow almost damned in a fair wife, that never set a squadron in a field, nor the division of a battle knows, more than a spinster, unless the bookish Theoric there wherein the togaed counsels can propose as masterly as he. Mere prattle without practice is all his soldiership. But he, sir, had the election, and I, of whom his eyes had seen the proof at Rhodes, at Cyprus, and on other grounds christened and heathened, must be beleed and calmed by debtor and creditor. This countercaster he in good time must his lieutenant be, and I, God bless the mark, his moreship's ensign. So the first reason that Iago gives for why he hates Othello and wants to destroy him is because Iago had wanted to become Othello's lieutenant. He'd wanted to get this promotion, but Othello gave the promotion to Michael Cassio, who doesn't have as much experience as being a soldier as Iago does. And so Iago is opposed to this. Iago feels himself slighted. Later in the play, in Act 2, Scene 1, for instance, we get a totally different explanation for why Iago hates Othello. He says, again talking to Roderigo, he says, "Thus do I..." skip that first line. He says, For mine own gained knowledge should profane, if I would time expend with such a snipe, but for my sport and profit." Sorry, that's, again, skip that bit. He's basically just mocking Roderigo for being an idiot with a lot of money. He says, "I hate the Moor, and it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he has done my office. I know not if it be true, but I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety." So the second reason that he gives is that he suspects Othello of having had sex with his wife, of having had sex with Emilia. Nothing else in the play suggests this. I mean, Emilia and Othello interact a number of times, and it's always very sort of surface level. It's always oriented around Desdemona, so there's not that much to sort of support this. And so it seems like a flimsy pretext. The one thing that Iago says that seems like a legitimate truth, and he says this twice. He says, I hate the more. So he says this in, that's Act 1, Scene 3, where that quote comes from. Sorry. So he says this in Act 1, Scene 3, lines 362 to 63, and 378 to 379. So he says this twice, I hate the more. But again, it's not particularly clear why. The two reasons that he gives are fairly surface level, and they're not really sufficient. Are they? So, writing about Hamlet, T.S. Eliot developed this idea of the objective correlative, that in order to justify a character's emotional reaction in a play, there needs to be something that actually occurs in the world that legitimizes it. Iago does not really seem to have an objective correlative here. Like getting passed over for this promotion, vague rumors that Othello might have had sex with his wife, you simply don't seem to be enough justification for developing this complex scheme that draws in a bunch of Venetian nobles who then kill one another for getting Othello to murder Desdemona. None of it seems justified by these arguments that he's making. So he's this weird, undefined, like he's been characterized as a motiveless, malignant evil, and he really kind of is. I mean, in a way, he's Heath Ledger's Joker from The Dark Knight. He doesn't seem to want anything in particular except to destroy the people he's set out to destroy. So he's a fascinating character. And I actually think his last line is one of his last two lines actually are one of the most hardcore lines we get out of Renaissance drama. He's been captured. He's going to be tortured. His scheme has been revealed. He says, "Demand me nothing. What you know, you know. From this time forth, I never will speak word." So he basically he leaves the play basically saying, "No, I'm going out on my own terms. Torture me if you want. I will not tell you anything more than you already know," which is actually kind of badass. But I think it also draws from Thomas Kyd's play The Spanish Tragedy, which Shakespeare was definitely familiar with because he echoes it almost directly in Hamlet. Because I think it's in The Spanish Tragedy where, after his plot has been revealed, the protagonist bites off his tongue so that he can't reveal the plot itself. It's another very hardcore moment from Renaissance drama. The other thing I want to talk about, the race issue I want to talk about just very, very quickly, is the idea of blackness. The idea of being a Moor is continually disparaged throughout the play by Venetian characters, Cypriot characters, etc., etc. But it's also disparaged periodically by Othello. There's a couple of places where he refers to himself as black and implies that that's negative. Like he says, for instance, "Happily, for I am black and have not those soft parts of conversation that chamberers have." He also says, if he's wrong about his suspicions about Desdemona, he says, "My name that was as fresh as Dian's visage is now begrimed and black as mine own face." So we've got these negative, racist, or at least racially charged critiques that Othello levels against himself. But I think we get this the most, this sort of sense of internalized racism, I think we get this the most in Othello's second to last speech, the speech where he sort of sets up his suicide. Because he describes himself perplexed in the extreme of one whose hand like the base Indian threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe, of one whose subdued eyes, albeit unused to the melting mood, drop tears as fast as the Arabian trees their medicinable gum. Set you down this, and say besides that in Aleppo once where a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus. Stabs himself. So here we get 3 references to non-European peoples, people of color. The base Indian who threw away a pearl richer than all his tribe. This is a metaphor for Othello. Othello is, well, it's a simile because it's like the base Indian. So this is a simile comparing Othello to that Indian. We get a metaphor with the Arabian trees dropping their medicinable gum. So Arabian trees, Middle Eastern, and again, Othello is a Moor, so he would be North African, possibly Arab, because the term Moor is very flexible at this period. And then the last 5 lines of this speech. And say besides that in Aleppo once where a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus. So in that anecdote, Othello takes the place of the malignant and turbaned Turk rather than the place of the Venetian whatever it is, trader, merchant, whatever it is. Othello here becomes the figure of the Turk in this speech, and the Turk has to be destroyed. The Turk is the enemy. And so Othello is here identifying himself with the enemy, and particularly an enemy who is non-European, an enemy who would be a person of color. And so Othello is really identifying himself away from the Venetians that he served so long and so well in so many wars against people who are ethnically probably more like him than the Venetians are.